Hello and welcome to The Conscious Capitalists, hosted by two of the co-founders of the Conscious Capitalism movement and co-authors of the Conscious Capitalism Field Guide from Harvard Business Press, Raj Sisodia and Timothy Henry. Each week, this podcast covers current events and business news and Raj and Timothy's latest thinking on what it takes to build a conscious business. For more information and notes from the show, go to www.theconsciouscapitalists.com. And now, Raj and Timothy.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 23 of The Conscious Capitalists with myself, Timothy Henry, and my partner in making the world a better place through business, Raj Sisodia. Hi, Raj.
Hi, Timothy. Great to see you again.
Good to see you again. Now, we have a magical sort of guest today, and a wonderful guest in so many ways. And Raj, maybe you should do the introduction.
Yes, so this is the legendary John Perkins, who I had the great good fortune to meet and get to actually spend 10 days together, traveling and staying in these amazing places in Ecuador. We were on a Pachamama Alliance founders journey with the three founders, Lynn Twist, Bill Twist, and John Perkins. And we'll get into that more in our conversation, but John has had an incredible trajectory in his life and career. Has bridged the modern and the traditional worlds, the indigenous cultures of the Amazon and Central and South America, as well as in the worlds of academia and international economic development. And as I said, I met him and I went on that 10-day journey, which was life-changing for me. I was writing the Healing Organization at the time, and Lynn basically told me, you need to come on this trip. If you're trying to write about healing, you will learn more in these 10 days than you could in a few years of research. So she pretty much ordered me to delay the book and just come on the trip. And I'm so glad I did. And we'll get into that a little more as we chat here. But a great part of that was listening to John share many stories and impart wisdom and take us through certain practices, as well as get his ideas around the Healing Organization as well. So welcome, John, and thank you for being with us today.
Well, it's great to be with you, Raj, again, and with you, Timothy, also. And I'm so honored. I love the work that both of you do. It's such important work, and this is such an incredibly critical time to be doing that work. So I'm very honored to be here today with you. Thank you.
Well, one of the things that I note is you've written 10 books that cover an incredible range of topics. And I suppose at one level, one of the books you're best known for is The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And at the same time, your most recent book, Touching the Jaguar, goes in a very different direction, vis-a-vis connecting the modern world to the ancient shamanic world. So maybe a good place to start is just tell us how you went from the economic hitman, self-confessed economic hitman, to your latest book.
Well, Timothy, the short version, after I graduated from business school in 1968, I joined the Peace Corps. Peace Corps sent me into the Amazon, and I spent 3 years in Ecuador, about 2 of them in the Amazon, and 1 up in the Andes. And although I was supposed to be forming credit and savings co-ops, that was my supposed job with the Peace Corps, I quickly discovered that the people I was working with had no currency. It was all barter. It's pretty hard to have a credit and savings co-op when it's your bananas for my papayas, that kind of thing. So I really didn't have anything to do except learn from them. And at one point, I became very, very ill. I lost a tremendous amount of weight. I couldn't keep any food down. I was out in the middle of the Amazon. It was 3 days of a very difficult journey to the nearest medical facility. I couldn't even stand up. There was no way I could do this. I was resigned to dying. And one night, a shaman said he could heal me, and he did. And he really did it by taking me on this shamanic trance, this shamanic journey. And on this journey, I have my eyes closed. It's nighttime. I'm in this wild place, this lodge with a shaman who's fierce looking. He's got tattoos on his face, and he's naked except for a loincloth. He was pretty scary. Did not look like any kind of I've ever seen. I come from New Hampshire, they don't look like that in New Hampshire. And in any case, I've got my eyes closed. I see this amorphous form. And the shaman yells to me, "Touch the jaguar." And I open my eyes and look all around because it's nighttime in the jungle. And where's that jaguar, And he says, no, 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 no. Close your eyes and see the jaguar. And this amorphous shape shifted into the jaguar. And I heard a voice say, "Son, it'll kill you." It was like my mother's voice. At that moment, I realized that I'd grown up in New Hampshire, as I said, with very mild foods. We didn't eat anything very interesting back in those days. And suddenly I'm in the Amazon eating very, very strange foods. And the people in the Amazon don't drink water because they know the rivers have organic matter that's not safe to drink the water. So they make a kind of beer. The women chew manioc root and spit it. It sets up a fermentation process that creates a type of beer. You can call it. You can add water to that. It's alcohol, and it purifies the water. So I'm drinking a lot of spit beer because there wasn't any Perrier, there wasn't any bottled water out there. I'm drinking a lot of squirming white grubs and other weird foods because there weren't any Cliff Bars. And what I realized on that journey is every time I did this, I'd hear a voice saying, "It'll kill you." At the same time, I saw how healthy and robust the Shuar people who was with, these indigenous people are. They're hunters and gatherers. They're robust, and they live to be very old if they don't die in a hunting accident or something like that. So that night I saw that it was not the food and drink killing me. It was my perception. And I was healthy after that. And the shaman said as payment to him, I needed to become his apprentice. Well, I have to say, Timothy and Raj, that I just graduated from business school. It's 1969. There was no future in shamanism in those days. I had no interest, but the guy saved me.
The Graduate had just come out, and weren't they saying it's plastics?
Yeah, exactly. And I believe that, But the guy saved my life, so I became his apprentice. And the first thing he taught me was, he said, touching the jaguar means that when there's something that's blocking us, when we have a fear, if we run from it, it'll chase us. But if we touch it, if we confront it, it'll give us power and energy. It'll help us change our perception. And when we change our perception, we change our reality. And that's what had happened. I changed my perception of what the food was doing to me, from killing me to making me healthy, and it worked. And after that, I studied with shamans in many other places. After I became an economic hitman, I traveled around the world. And I always tried to take time off and study with shamans in Indonesia and Iran and Egypt and all over Latin America. And everywhere I went, I found that they have that same common belief that we change our reality by altering our perceptions. And of course, as I looked into this, I came to realize that that's the basis for modern psychotherapy. It's the basis for quantum physics. It's the basis for business, advertising, public relations. It's the basis for politics. Our perceptions control our reality. There is no United States. There is no England where you are. There are no religions. There are no corporations except as we perceive them. And when enough people accept a perception, codify it into law, and take the actions, then it has a huge impact on reality. It was an incredible teaching experience. And, then after I got out of the Peace Corps, I went back to doing what I've been trained to do. I became an economist. I became chief economist at a consulting firm. I became an economic hitman. So the transition kind of went that way. And then after I quit being an economic hitman, when I saw the light, we can get into that if you want, 10 years later, I went back to the Amazon and made the transition kind of back. But I was making these own bridges in my life. So in answer to your question, I'd written 5 books on shamanism, and then I later wrote 4 books on economics, global economics, and then the 5th book ties the two together. It's Touching the Jaguar, which is recent. That was all.
So, John, talk a little bit about your disillusionment with the world of international economic development, and how, I was reminded of a quote from Eric Hoffer, who said, things start out as a movement, then they become a business, and then they become a racket. That's kind of the normal trajectory if you're not careful about many things. Huh? It felt like you discovered something that you thought was trying to do good in the world that had devolved into a kind of racket.
Yeah, that's totally true, Raj. When I became an economist after the Peace Corps, I thought I was doing the right thing. My job, and especially then within a couple of years, I became chief economist, and my job was to convince the leaders of countries to accept huge loans from the World Bank or other financial institutions. But the money never went to the countries. They had to take on the debt and use their resources like oil as collateral. But the money went to our own corporations, the Bechtels and Halliburtons and General Electrics, to build big infrastructure projects in those countries, power plants and industrial parks and highways and ports. And these things helped a few wealthy individuals, but they didn't help the majority of the people, because the majority of the people the money was diverted from social things like education and healthcare to pay off the loans. So the American companies were making lots of money. The few wealthy families in these countries were doing very well. And the statistics showed, but I didn't understand that dynamic at the beginning. What I understood at the beginning was what the statistics show is that if you invest a lot of money in a poor country, if you invest it into infrastructure, the economy grows. And it does. Statistically, the GDP, the gross domestic product, grows. So I thought for a number of years that I was doing the right thing because it's what's taught in business school, it's what the World Bank promotes. But over time, I began to see that it was only helping these wealthy people and that they are the GDP. So even like in the United States, if you take the United States, there's 3 individuals who have as much wealth as half the population of the United States. If those 3 individuals made 10% on their investments last year, and half the population lost 3%, the GDP was still growing at something between 3 and 4%. And that's true all over the world. So what I began to understand is that we were selling a false perception. We get back to that perception. The perception that investing in getting big profits for our corporations and helping a few wealthy families was helping everybody in the country. And it was creating a reality that was making the wealthy wealthier, and the big corporations wealthier, but the poor were getting poorer or staying at the same level. And over time, I began to see that. And that's when it took me about 10 years before I finally got out.
I remember you telling us the story as we were driving across a dam that was built in Ecuador. And I think you had been involved in the financing of that. And didn't you actually have some death threats and you had to fear for your own safety at some point because of your outspokenness?
Yes, that's been a thread. And I actually, after the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman came out about 3 or 4 months after that, I was supposed to speak at the United Nations. And I was the night before I was supposed to speak there, I was poisoned and rushed to a hospital in New York, Lenox Hill Hospital, where they ended up removing 70% of my large intestine. And that's what I came to understand as I looked into this more was that I probably wasn't poisoned by the CIA or NSA or one of these organizations that people suspected, because if they tried to poison me, I wouldn't be speaking to you now, probably. Plus, they knew that for them, a book is not that big a deal. It's not immediate. It takes time for these books and movies. But they don't like people who are an immediate threat, and they realize that if something happens to me, my books are going to sell like wildfire. I mean, the Confessions has sold about 2.5 million copies, but it would have probably sold a lot more if I had died a mysterious death, and that's exactly the opposite of what they want. So yeah, and I should mention, and we can go. I don't want to keep talking here, but when I had that part of my intestine removed, it all actually, in the long run, it created an amazing physical shapeshift in my body. We can get into if you want, but I'll turn it over to you.
Tell us about that, please. Yeah.
Well, I spent 2 weeks in this hospital in New York, Lenox Hill. And when I got out, the gastroenterologist, who was a very academic and intellectual and interesting character man, at the last meeting I had with him before flying back home to where I lived at the time, was Florida. He held up. I was in his office, and he said, "You know, while you've been in the hospital, I read this book, Shapeshifting, that you wrote." He said, "You know, I should be telling you right now that you are a carnivore, and you shouldn't eat any vegetables or fruits, or really minimize them, because carnivores have very short large intestines. Herbivores have very large ones, and omnivores like humans have something in between. I've just taken 70% of your intestines, so you've now become a carnivore." But he said, "You know, I read your book, Shapeshifting, and I think if you practice the things you write about, you can change that." Because he said, when you came in here, you had 7 feet of large intestine. I took 5. But you had 25 feet of small intestine, of which the last 5 feet don't really perform much of a function other than to connect to the large intestine. I think if you practice what you talk about in these books, you can shapeshift that 5 feet of small intestine into large intestine and live a perfectly normal life. Well, it's happened, Raj. Timothy, I have to tell you, I'm a vegetarian, essentially. And so when I go in the Amazon, I'm with people that rely on meat. I'll go along with their customs. But for the rest of my life, I'm totally a vegetarian. So that happened. And it's one of those things that people talk about as being miraculous. But the fact of the matter is, it's not all that miraculous. It's a shapeshift. And it's due to changing our perception and changing the reality around that.
Well, I love that story for the element of sort of the modern economic theory, and you're being on the cutting edge of that in terms of the billions of dollars that were being invested in some of these projects, and your ability to be on the ground and understand that there's a different reality on the ground that you were perceiving and being sensitive to. And in your latest book, you certainly start to describe this very eloquently, but then you also start to bring in this idea of the life economy and the death economy. And sort of a parallel with what we were just talking about in terms of economic development traditionally, and maybe what was on the ground. So maybe tell us a little bit about that life and death economy and how you came to frame it that way.
Sure. What I was really creating, I was one of the soldiers in the trenches of creating this death economy, which is an economic system that is consuming itself into extinction. We're in the short term, we're ravaging the very resources upon which the long term depends. Corporations do this. Executives are in there for a few years, and they're not looking at the long term very much. And also, there's a large function based on war, or the threat of war. So the military industry is very large in this death economy. That death economy is based on one perception. And that is the perception that corporations must maximize short-term shareholder profits, and individuals should maximize their material consumption, regardless of the social and environmental costs. Now that's perception. It really came into power in 1976. There's one moment. It had been building before then. It had been a long history of building up to this. But in 1976, when Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize in economics, that was one of his main theses. In fact, he said that if we maximize short-term profits, all the environmental and social problems will take care of themselves. Well, and Friedman, even though that had been building up, von Hayek had said something similar a few years earlier when he got the Nobel Prize, but Friedman had incredible credibility. He was an advisor to Reagan and Thatcher and to governments in Chile, all over the world. And people had tremendous respect for him. And this caught on. And so since then, corporate executives, that's been their goal. You've got to maximize short-term profits. And that's Wall Street pushes and pushes and pushes them to that. And that's created this death economy. The life economy, on the other hand, is based on a perception that we need to maximize long-term benefits for people and nature. And we pay people, we give decent rates of return to investors, we pay workers to clean up pollution. you know, to mine all the plastic that's in the oceans and recycle it. We pay to regenerate destroyed environments, to recycle, to create new technologies. So all we got to do is change that perception. Again, it's that idea that our perception creates our reality. If you have a perception that you've got to maximize short-term profits, CEOs then come into it and they say, well, I've got to do whatever it takes, including corrupting politicians or legally corrupting them by giving them, huge campaign donations. It's become legal now. Corruption has become legal in that regard. By destroying the environment, I got to do whatever it takes to maximize short-term profits. But if you change that perception to long-term benefits, something entirely different happens. And, we can get into what the coronavirus, its impact here. But even before that, we were on the path to change. I was very encouraged. Conscious capitalism. And, that is moving us toward a life economy. The Green New Deal is moving us toward a life economy. B corporations, benefit corporations, all of those are moving that way. In August of 2018, the same year that Raj and I were in the Amazon together, the board, the business roundtable, 180 some odd executives from some of the largest corporations in the world came together, and they basically said, we've got to create a life economy. They didn't use those terms, but they said it can no longer just be about maximizing short-term profits. We have to work toward taking care of our employees and our consumers and the suppliers and the communities where we work. So we've been on this trajectory. Now I think we're being pushed I think this virus has pushed us even harder to see that we must move quickly.
Yeah, and I love that because it also goes to some of the stories you write about being in the forest, in the jungles, and the perceptions that some of the native peoples had around how things were so interconnected. And I love in your recent book, you talk about going out into the forest, and there was this plan that somehow you could turn these Amazonian jungles into farmland, and that would be fine. And then somebody took you out and said, look, you see how interconnected these things are, but there's only like a few inches of topsoil. And if you cut down all the trees, the topsoil washes away. And what you're actually left with, once all the vegetation has died because the trees are gone, is a very hard-baked surface that you couldn't grow anything on, and you become basically a semi-arid desert. And the native peoples understood that, but we didn't. And that's where I connected your story about the life economy being partly related to the perception those people had about, hey boys, we're all connected here.
Yes, and unfortunately, what's happened even as we've moved in the United States, and China has moved to becoming more conscious of not creating pollution, and many other countries have, in some respects, we've been just exporting that. So, we don't drill for oil off the coast of California or many coasts in the United States, but instead we drill for oil in the heart of the Amazon, and we do it with a lot fewer restrictions, a lot fewer regulations. So if we drill off the coast of the United States, there's very strong regulations, and by God, if you have an oil spill, you're going to clean it up. You're going to spend whatever it takes to clean it up, as we saw with BP. Oil spill in the Gulf. The oil spill in the Amazon that Texaco did was about 80 times larger than that, and they haven't paid a cent. They've refused to pay to clean it up, and the regulations are not strictly enforced there. So yes. So the next move now is to truly understand the importance of coming together as a global community. That we can't just save the climate of the United States or England or anywhere else. We've got to, it's the whole world. And I think the coronavirus has helped us see that everybody's been impacted. In the past, if you had a once in 100 year event, and they were happening every year or so, a hurricane, an oil spill, fires, tsunamis, earthquakes, whatever, the indigenous people always said, well, that's Mother Nature, Pachamama, speaking to us. But we would say, well, this is local. If I survive the hurricane, the outside world is going to come to my assistance. This water is going to arrive, and food's going to arrive at some point. It's local. But the coronavirus has taught us the Pachamama speaking to the whole world. Everybody on the planet, including those deep in the Amazon, have been impacted. Every animal, like this lovely small jaguar I've got over my shoulder here, the animals are all impacted in one way or another. So we no longer can look for help from the outside world because we're it. There is no other outside world. And my Amazonian friends who I've been in touch with during this pandemic by phone and internet from time to time will tell us that it's nature is speaking to us very strongly now. That the microbial world, the invisible world, is stepping forth and teaching us that we have to come together. We can't stop the virus in London or in Boston where Raj is, or near Seattle where I am. We've got to stop it everywhere. We've got to deal with it. It's global. We've all got to come together.
John, one of the things I learned from you and one of the books that you wrote is called The World Is As You Dream It. And the beautiful wisdom around the dream cultures of the indigenous people there, that I think in one of your books you wrote, if you were asking the shaman about how did the world become such a mess, and he said, well, that was your dream, and those are the consequences of the dream. I said, what do we do about it? He said, well, you need to dream a new dream, right? And so if you could talk about that a little bit, what does that mean to you, this idea the world is as you dream it, and how do we dream a better dream collectively?
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Raj. So the dream, and when they say the word dream, they're really talking about perception. They're not just talking about the nighttime. It may come in nighttime dreams, but it's also our value system. It's that perception of what it means to be successful. And so after I left being an economic hitman, I went back to Ecuador. I went back to the people who'd saved my life when I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer. And I said, now I want to come and help you. I want to help you save your forests, because I knew they were under attack. And they said, well, that's great, but don't come here and try to change us. We're not destroying the forest. It's you. It's your oil companies. It's your cattle ranches. It's your mining companies. And most of all, it's your dream. It's the dream of the modern world. A dream, a perception that what we need to do is short-term profits, is build bigger buildings and more buildings and have more cars and so on and so forth. So they said, you've got to go back and change the dream of your people. And that's when I founded an organization called Dream Change, and then later the Pachamama Alliance, and began writing these 5 books on shamanism, which I wrote before I ever wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Again, it's for them, it's quite clear. It's about changing our perception of what it means to be human on this planet. And, let's face it, we humans are the pilots of this space station, Earth. And in recent years, we've been guiding her toward disaster, the death economy. So now it's time to do what both of you are so dedicated to, this conscious capitalism, turn things around, reboot the navigation system, pilot toward a life economy, pilot towards something that's toward an economic, social, economic, governmental systems that are actually renewable resources. And if we look at human history, we've been around for 200,000 plus years as human beings, as we know ourselves. And for most of that time, we've lived in life economies. And the goal was always the long term, the famous 7th generation. And I got to say, all the indigenous people I know, they don't think 7 generations ahead, but they think 2 or 3 or 4. They think of their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. And throughout most of history, that's what it's been like. And that's what the indigenous, traditional people still live traditional hunter and gatherer lives, still live that way. It's only been in the blink of an eye, historically, we could say maybe a couple of thousand years, but especially the last couple of hundred years, and especially since 1976, when Milton Friedman made that statement, that we've really moved rapidly, exponentially into this idea that it's not about long term, it's about short term. And so, that's one of the great things that the Mayan people of Guatemala have to teach us, that the people of the Amazon and Andes have to teach us, and, I take people to all these different groups. And it's a lesson that throughout history, for 200,000 years, human beings have understood. And here we are, supposedly the smartest we've ever been. The smartest species on the planet, but we've missed up until now the most important part of what it means to be human and how to be the pilot of the space station. But I don't mean to be negative, because I really feel that this is all changing. There is a new trajectory, and the two of you represent that so very, very well in the programs that you're implementing, and it's happening. We just need to make sure it keeps happening faster.
I love the way you've described it. It's a beautiful way of describing sort of the human species journey we've been on. And earlier today, I was in a seminar. The British Academy over here is sponsoring a program on the future of the corporation. And today we were talking about purpose and impact. And we had Al Gore, when he left the American political scene, he helped form an investment group called Generation Investment. And David Blood, a former Goldman Sachs partner, co-founded it with him. And they were talking today about the incredible, or at least David was talking today about the incredible returns that are available from impact investing. So it's almost like we've now got a new name for it. We're calling it impact investing. And it's, you know, it's part of this perceptional change, I think, that you're talking about. We're starting to go over that perception bridge a little bit. Now, having said that, I mean, there's these really positive things out there. When Raj wrote Firms of Endearment and then redid the book, showed these great economic charts that show, listen, businesses that operate this way, they're just better businesses, you know, and that's the core of our sort of whole conscious capitalism story is, you know, we have to change that narrative exactly the way you said, that perception. And yet, for, you know, there's economic data that shows this is a better way. There's sort of a history and a whole sort of, you know, natural story about why we should be behaving differently, and yet we don't. And this is the part that I was intrigued by, because when I work with some leadership teams and CEOs, what I sort of get is there's this fear, you know, like, you know, I go back to the old way, because that's the safe way. And, you know, so there's this fear that many businesses or leaders have that somehow they won't be successful, or they won't be able to maintain their position if they go on this journey. And I'm just curious because, you know, the title of your book is Touching the Jaguar, which is really about facing our fears. So when you look at that perception bridge, when you look at touching the Jaguar and you look at where we are from your economist's eyes, what needs to shift? Where should we be pushing that story to another level that will help people touch the Jaguar?
Yeah, well, Timothy, and the subtitle of Touching the Jaguar, incidentally, is Transforming Fear into Action to Change Your Life and the World. It's on the cover of the book, you know. And it is about fear, and it's fear of change. You know, people don't like change, and it's hard to accept that. I had a very difficult time in the Amazon accepting that food that was making that, I mean, it was pretty, if you think about it, it's pretty obvious. I'm living with people the men carry dead animals that weigh 300 pounds, like big, what do you call them, peccaries, wild boars out of the jungle. These guys have got legs with muscles that will make soccer players jealous, you know, and they're so healthy and robust, and they're eating these foods. But I'm there, and I'm like, no, the foods are making me sick. Well, that doesn't make any sense, does it, rationally? But I've got this ingrained in me, this idea that you've got to eat certain types of food, or be, you know. So anyway, we really have a tough time changing. We fear change. But when we touch that fear, we gain so much. And Indigenous people, I think, really understand the importance of change. They're always changing. You know, if the river starts to rise, they know they got to move their village. They're open to change. They see change as an opportunity to explore new territory, to create new technologies, if you will. And of course, we've seen that too during wars. That's when we create some of our most amazing technologies, or, you know, that kind of thing. So, but I think above all else, this coronavirus has taught us that we can change. We've all had to change. We've all changed. And maybe it's been uncomfortable, but it's also been incredibly enlightening. Right? The fact we're doing this. Now, we might have done this before the coronavirus, but I'm on the board of directors of the Pachamama Alliance, and we every year, 4 times a year, used to get together. Everybody flew to San Francisco or drove cars to San Francisco and met there. The last 2 board meetings we've done this way. And we've been able to bring in 250 of our top supporters who are all over the world, which we never did before. On and on. We all know. So this fear of change, and that's the fear we must touch. And I do want to say that I meet so many corporate executives that want to change. Here's an example. So a couple of years ago, I was speaking at a big international economic forum in St. Petersburg, Russia. There were 12,000 people there, including President Putin, Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, and corporate executives from all the big banks in the United States and all over the world, and a lot of big companies. And I would talk about the life and death economy. And during the receptions afterwards, the Russians have some great receptions, incidentally. If you like caviar and vodka,
Who doesn't really?
or champagne is also that. I don't prefer that, but anyway. And I would get into these discussions with some of these top executives who would say things like, I get grandkids. I want to do the right thing. But I know that if I do the right thing, my company may lose market share in the short term, or our stock prices may go down over the next couple of months. And if that happens, my Wall Street will fire me. My top investors will probably get rid of me. And they'll replace me with someone who only cares about stock prices or market share. And so they say, please go out there, write books, go out there and tell people, it's up to the consumer, the employee, the investor. We all have to push toward this. And, if you're an entrepreneur starting a company, that's a little different. But if we're trying to change some already existing huge corporation, the inertia is there. Wall Street has a problem with them making these changes, and it's up to us. I'm reminded of Franklin Roosevelt, who toward the end of World War II, one of his last meetings, he met with leaders of the auto workers unions. And at the end of the meeting, as the people were leaving the Oval Office, he was shaking their hands. He said, I think you all know that I'm with you. I want to do what you want me to do, but now you got to go out and get your rank and file to push me to do it. That's the only way I'm going to be able to get it through Congress and the voters. And every corporate executive, most all corporate executives, if they work for a publicly traded company especially, faces this. And we the people, we the consumers, we the employees, we the investors, we got to push. We got to push. It's going to take all of us.
One of the interesting things I learned when we were together, John, as part of the Pachamama Alliance, and I want to ask you a little bit more about that as well, is this idea that has grown now that nature has rights, and that many countries like Ecuador, I think Ecuador was the pioneer in that, but instituting that into their constitution. Do you think that's a pathway forward? That we need to create, I think there are 38 countries now that do that.
Well, yeah, I think it's important, but Ecuador is an interesting example because although they were the first to put it in their constitution, they haven't done a very good job of enforcing it. And, the U.S. corporations like the oil companies like Texaco, Chevron have done a terrible job there, as I mentioned earlier, terrible pollution that they don't clean up. And now today, the Chinese are going in big time, and they're mining. They're building these huge mines for copper, gold, silver, and precious metals, and they're putting things at risk. You mentioned earlier, Raj, that dam that we went by, the Agoyan Dam that I helped finance in Ecuador, and that put the country into debt. But I got to say that our American engineers did a damn good job. It's a good dam, and it's worked for many, many years, as you saw. The Chinese recently put the country in deep debt, and they built another dam, which was supposed to serve a third of the country, and they happened to build it on a fault line and next to an active volcano and in the middle of an extremely fragile rainforest. And it has never functioned at full. It's 8 generators, only 4 have ever operated, and I don't think any of them are operating right now. They did a bad engineering job. So despite these laws, and I'm writing a book right now. The next book I'm writing is about the relationships between China, the New Silk Road, and the world and the United States. And I actually think, there's some real opportunities if we can all work together. I think the Chinese they understand the problem, and I don't want to badmouth the Chinese. I also don't want to be saying that that they're on completely the right path. So there's both sides of everything. But in response to your question, yes, we need those kinds of laws, but we also need to make sure that they're enforced, and they're enforced in a way that's global. And again, I'd go back to some of the US laws around pollution, around drilling for oil, around so many aspects of our pollution that we enforce in the United States, but it's exported. And in a way, the Chinese are doing something similar. They're doing a pretty good job in their country of trying to reduce pollution, trying not to build more coal-fired plants for one thing, but they're exporting coal-fired plants. So it's the challenge here is to do something that human beings have never done, and that is see us as one species, regardless of culture, religion, color, ethnicity, country, that we are all on this planet together, and we're all piloting this space station. And I really think that the coronavirus is a message in that direction, whether you look at it from a shamanic standpoint or a scientific standpoint. It's giving us...
Well, and it even goes beyond that. Even if we come together as one species, we are one of many species, and all of us have to be able to play our role in that interconnected system, right? I think that's what I learned from the Amazon experience, among many other things, is just this sense that, of course, we don't come into this planet, we come out of this planet. We're as much as part of nature as a tree is. And the way that the shamans there talk about that in the West, we connect with everything from our heads, and that they say you need to connect from down here, right? From your heart and your body, and connect from spirit to spirit, including the spirit of even what we consider inanimate things like stones and rocks and so forth. I mean, there's a deep veneration for that.
Yes.
And it's really something I think that I was really moved by. I constantly reminded myself to connect from here.
Wonderful point. And yes, it's absolutely true. It's the spirit and everything, according to them, and they're all speaking to us. So the earthquakes, the fires, the rising sea levels, the melting glaciers, those are all what we would call coming from inanimate objects. They're all speaking to us. The animals that are going extinct are sacrificing themselves in a way to send us this message. The coronavirus itself has come out of animals, as did HIV, as did this earlier SARS virus. And they've come out of animals. They've come out of nature. And they're all speaking to us very, very, very strongly. I'm reminded of the time when I took a group like the one you were on, Raj. I don't think we didn't go to this particular shaman lady up in the Andes named the wonderful name of Maria Juana, Yambirla. And somebody in the group asked, so Maria Juana, what do we need to do to save the earth? And she laughs and she says, the earth, Pachamama's not in danger. We humans are, but we're just like so many fleas. And if we get to be too much of a nuisance, she'll just shake us all off. Maria Juana points up at Imbabura, this powerful volcano that hovers over her house. And she said, just a few years ago, that volcano was covered with a massive ice cap. It isn't anymore. Pachamama's speaking to us. She's not shaking us off yet, but she's twitching. And the twitching has grown worse since then. And every time we've had a major hurricane, a once in a 100-year event, I've thought about Maria Juana. And now this virus is a big twitch. It's a big twitch. We just need to totally comprehend it and give thanks that the world is speaking to us. And I'm not trying to downplay the terrible suffering, the people who've lost loved ones, and all the problems it's caused. Those are all very real and tragic. And we need to listen so that we don't. If we don't listen, something more tragic is going to happen in the future. I think, and Timothy, just before we began, you were saying that you were meeting some people earlier today that were involved in developing vaccines, and they're expecting something. They're planning on something worse coming. I don't think it will get worse if we just listen, but if we don't, for sure it will.
We're going to be playing a lot of defense against nature. And well, as you were speaking, as Raj talked about, sort of, giving rights to nature, there's this movement, the ESG movement, which is starting to pick up steam. I think when I started monitoring it a couple of years ago, it was like an alphabet soup. There were so many different things. Now there's a couple of major efforts underway to come up with 2 or 3 well-described standards. And you have things like the Financial Times running moral money columns once a week, and now tracking ESG as one of the sections that they regularly talk about in their paper. So I'm also a little hopeful that maybe that is an angle where we're starting to say that, hey, we have to look at what a company is doing, and we're going to look at it with this kind of report card that talks about the environment, that talks about society, and then says, how are you governing? Are you transparent? Are you fair? And all these things. And I'm curious whether that whole ESG world and impact investing, how does that resonate with you? Does that feel like it's directionally correct? Or do you think there's something else that's needed to move that to a different level?
Well, I think we're in a transition period where those things are transitionally correct. And we need to push harder, and we really need to get, as Raj mentioned, bring this heart and mind idea together. So traditionally, we've been very oriented toward intuition, human beings, and we've listened. We've been very spiritually connected with our surroundings, but in the last moving up to the last couple of thousand years, we become more and more oriented toward the aspect that says we are not part of nature. We are a part from nature, not a part of. And our job is to exploit nature. Well, I think we're moving. All of these things that you'd mentioned, Timothy, are moving us in that direction of realizing that we are part of, and we really have to respect that. And we have to respect the rights of nature, all the rights of nature. Yes. Now, the indigenous people will tell you, a lot of people may believe in past and future lives, but I think most of the people that we probably know would believe that our past lives are human. Well, the indigenous people will tell you that their past lives and their future lives are trees and plants and rocks and animals. That they all have spirit, and that in each one of these lives we've got something to learn. And with that kind of a belief system, you're a lot more careful of how you treat trees and rocks and animals if you have that background. So I think that that's a very important aspect of this: is how do we open our hearts and our minds to really understand that this cat who just left me in an hour there shuffling papers on my desk. She's a great teacher for me, and to recognize her rights, and she's got a right to go over there and shuffle those papers. She's going to knock them off the desk pretty soon, and that's a message for me probably that I should stop fooling around with so much paperwork and play with her instead. But I think that it's so important that we really, really listen. The scientific community now has come to understand through this coronavirus that when you don't have factories running, you don't have as much pollution. There's no question about it. We could all talk about it before it's become very, very obvious. It's amazing how the pharmaceutical companies around the world, whether it's in Russia or China or England or the United States or wherever, have created vaccines in such an amazingly short period of time. Now, the indigenous people will tell you that the vaccine is a spirit. And when people talk about not believing or trusting in the vaccine, they'll say, well, it's not about the chemical. It's about the spirit. And what you're doing is you're injecting people with the spirit that's responding to the spirit of the disease. And that's exactly what the disease wants. That's exactly what the virus is there for. It's there to tell us that we can overcome it And the vaccine overcomes it in the short run, but in the long run, the only way to overcome these sorts of things is to change the way we live. And I think that's a wonderful metaphor for so much that's going on. The rights of nature, laws, are a great short-run movement, but in the long run, we've got to really obey them. We've got to enforce them. We've got to listen to them. We can say that about so many things.
Wow. Thank you so much, John. I feel like you're a gift to humanity. We're all fortunate to be sharing the planet with you, and somebody with your great depth and wisdom guiding us in the right way. I recommend strongly to all of our listeners, John has 10 books now. They're incredibly readable, incredibly inspiring and touching and moving. And so please do look up his work and join the Pachamama Alliance. They're doing great things in the world. Take their seminar, Awakening the Dreamer, Changing the Dream, which I think comes from some of the language we heard from John today. And again, it's really been a joy to have you with us, John. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's just great to hear that ancient wisdom being brought into the modern reality that we're trying to deal with, and this whole issue of connecting our hearts. And as leaders, and everybody's a leader in their own way, but being able to connect to that heart and come from a different place. I mean, that's a big part of this journey to correct some of the mistakes that we've been making. So thank you so much for sharing that ancient wisdom with us today.
My pleasure, Timothy. Raj, thank you for inviting me. And people can go to my website, johnperkins.org, and get all that information if you write it down, as Raj was talking about Pachamama and the Alliance and so forth. I would just like to leave by saying I think we all are living in a very blessed time. And we're blessed alive right now, where nature is speaking so clearly, so loudly, and we can listen to her. We are listening to her, and to be in the roles that you each play, and together play, of bringing this message out that's so essential, it's so powerful, it's so inspiring. I thank you for doing what you're doing, and I'm glad to be a small part of that. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, listeners, or those of you that have enjoyed today's podcast. Please note, on whatever channel you're listening, there is a little button somewhere that says subscribe. And so if you enjoyed this, please hit that subscribe button. And if you want to know more about the things Raj and I are doing, or leave us a comment, please come to theconsciouscapitalists.com. And there's a place where you can leave a comment for us. And of course, if you want to know more about the practice of conscious capitalism, we do have a book, The Conscious Capitalism Field Guide. And Raj, if they want to know more about conscious capitalism more broadly, what should they do?
Go to consciouscapitalism.org and find a chapter close to where you are, or think about starting a chapter if there is one.
Wonderful. Thank you all very much.